Welcome to the 9th episode of the world-proven conspiracies in history, the Pisonian Conspiracy of 65 CE. You must first walk through the ashes of a burned city. Rome in the year 65 was a nightmare of dust, construction noise and paranoia. Only months earlier, the Great Fire of 64 had gutted the heart of the empire, destroying 10 of the 14 districts. While the poor slept in tents in the Campus Martius, the Emperor Nero seized the charred land in the valley between the Palatine and Esquiline hills to build the Domus Aurea, his golden house. It was a palace so vast it swallowed the city centre, complete with artificial lakes, rotating dining rooms, and a colossal 120-foot bronze statue of Nero himself. To the Roman aristocracy, this was not just architecture, it was a declaration of war against the Republic's soul. Nero was no longer a princeps, a first citizen. He was a Hellenistic god-king, acting on stage, singing to the lyre, and forcing the Senate to applaud his artistic delusions while the empire burned. It was in this atmosphere of humiliation and terror that the conspiracy was born, a sprawling, desperate coalition of the most powerful men and women in Rome, who decided that for the state to live, the artist had to die. The major names in this tragedy form a cross-section of Roman society, proving how deeply the hatred for Nero had penetrated. At the figurehead stood Gaius Calpurnius Piso, a tall, handsome, and immensely popular aristocrat. He was a man of the old nobility, charming, generous with his wealth, and lacking any real political spine. He was the perfect vessel for the conspiracy because he looked like an emperor, but lacked the ruthlessness to be one. But the brains and the muscle lay elsewhere. There was Faenius Rufus, one of the 2 prefects of the Praetorian Guard. This was the man charged with protecting the emperor's life. Yet he joined the plot because he feared his colleague, the sadistic Tigellinus, was poisoning Nero's mind against him. There was the intellectual heart of Rome, Lucius Annaeus Seneca, the Stoic philosopher and Nero's former tutor, who had retired from court, but whose name lent the plot moral legitimacy. Beside him was his nephew, the brilliant 25-year-old poet Lucan, who had once been Nero's friend, but had been banned from reciting poetry because Nero was jealous of his talent. And perhaps most importantly, there was a woman named Apicaris, a freedwoman of mysterious background, whose courage would shame the noblest men of Rome. The date chosen for the assassination was the festival of the Games of Ceres, the Caesarialia, specifically the final day of the Games in April of 65 CE. The conspirators selected this time because Nero, terrified of the public after the fire, had secluded himself in his palace and rarely ventured out. The Circus Maximus, however, was the one place he could not avoid. He loved the chariot races. The plan relied on the chaos of the games to mask their movements. The intended victim was Nero alone. The conspirators debated killing Tigellinus, the head of the secret police, but decided against it, fearing that a double murder would complicate the succession. They believed that once the head was cut off, the body of the tyranny would wither. The conspiracy was not funded by foreign gold or bribed mercenaries. It was a revolt of the stomach, fueled by a desire to survive. The senators involved, like Plosocles Lateranus and Flavius Scavenus, were driven by the fear that their properties would be confiscated to pay for the Golden House. The soldiers, like the tribune Subrius Flavarius, were driven by military honour. Flavus famously stated that he hated Nero, not because of his cruelty, but because a Roman emperor driving a chariot and singing on stage was a disgrace to the uniform. The motive was a strange mix of high Stoic idealism and base self-preservation. They wanted to restore the dignitas of Rome. They wanted a ruler who acted like a Roman man, not a Greek actor. However, there was a deep fissure in their motive. They did not agree on what would happen after Nero died. Piso thought he would be emperor. The soldiers had other ideas. Some whispered that Seneca should take the throne, replacing a bad emperor with a wise philosopher. This lack of a unified post-assassination plan was the rot at the core of the plot. I am Zar, educating the common man about famous conspiracies of our history. If you like my content, kindly like, subscribe and comment. The importance of the Pisonian Conspiracy in history cannot be overstated. It was the last great gasp of the Roman opposition. It represented the collision of the 2 great forces of the 1st century, the brute power of the Principate and the moral resistance of Stoicism. If it had succeeded, the Julio-Claudian dynasty would have ended 3 years early, likely preventing the Jewish War and the chaos of the Year of the 4 Emperors. It also marks a turning point in Western thought. The failure of the conspiracy led to the martyrdom of the Stoic opposition, creating a legacy of resistance to tyranny that would inspire thinkers from the Renaissance to the founding fathers of the United States. The deaths of Seneca and Lucan turned them into secular saints, their final words recorded as gospels of liberty. The execution of the plot was a masterclass in incompetence. It was arguably the worst executed conspiracy in the history of the Roman Empire. The problem was scale. To kill an emperor surrounded by German bodyguards, the conspirators felt they needed numbers. They recruited incessantly. They brought in tribunes, centurions, senators, knights, and even women. It is estimated that over 40 high-ranking people were privy to the plot. In the world of covert operations, a secret shared by 40 people is not a secret, it is a rumor. The plan was for the designated assassin, the Senator Scaevinus, to approach Nero in the Circus Maximus while the emperor was distracted by the races. Plautus Lateranus, a massive man, would throw himself at Nero's feet as if begging for a favour, then tackle him and pin him down. Then the officers would rush in with swords to finish the job. Piso was to wait at the Temple of Ceres to be hailed as the new emperor by the Praetorian Guard. But the plot collapsed before a single knife was drawn, unravelling due to the carelessness of Flavius Scaevinus. Scaevinus was a soft, wealthy senator who saw himself as a Brutus but acted like a fool. The night before the planned attack, he returned home and staged a melodramatic scene. He signed his will. He ordered his slaves to prepare bandages and styptics for wounds. He gave his favourite slaves their freedom and money. Most damningly, he took an ancient dagger from the Temple of Sallus, which he treated as a holy relic, and handed it to his freedman Milicus, with orders to sharpen it on a whetstone until it had a razor's edge. Milicus was not a fool. He saw the will, the bandages, the sudden generosity, and the sharpening of the dagger. He went home to his wife, who advised him that if he stayed silent, he would be an accomplice, but if he spoke, he would be a rich man. At dawn, Milicus rushed to the civilian gardens where Nero was staying and demanded to see the emperor. He was blocked by the porters, but his desperation got him an audience with Epaphroditus, Nero's secretary. When he was finally brought before Nero, he produced the dagger and told the emperor everything. The unravelling was swift. Scaevinus was arrested and dragged before Nero and Tigellinus. At first he bluffed brilliantly. He claimed the dagger was a family heirloom he always kept sharp, and that the will and bandages were just prudent housekeeping. He almost convinced Nero, but then Milicus remembered another name. He remembered that Scaevinus had been in a long whispered conference with another conspirator, Antonius Natalis. Natalis was arrested. The two men were interrogated separately. They were asked a simple question: "What were you talking about yesterday?" Their stories did not match. Under the threat of torture, the rack and the fire, Natalis broke first. He named Piso, then Scaevinus. Seeing the game was up, broke as well. He named everyone. He named Seneca. He named Lucan. He named the soldiers. The dominoes began to fall. What followed was a spectacle of moral cowardice that shamed the Roman aristocracy. The great men of Rome, the heirs of the Scipios and the Catos, scrambled to betray their own families to save their skins. The poet Lucan, the darling of the literary world, who wrote of liberty and the Republic, was tortured. Terror broke him. In a desperate bid for mercy, he named his own innocent mother, Acelia, as a conspirator. It remains one of the darkest stains on literary history. However, amidst this cavalcade of betrayal, one figure stood tall. Epicharis, the freedwoman who had been involved in the plot to recruit the fleet officers, was arrested. Nero assumed that a woman, and a former slave at that, would break instantly under pain. He was wrong. The torturers tore her body apart with the rack, the scourge and fire. She refused to give up a single name. Her silence was so absolute that the torturers, exhausted, had to carry her back to her cell in a chair because her legs were broken. The next day, as they carried her back for a second round of torture, she stripped the breastband from her dress, tied it in a noose to the canopy of the chair, and hanged herself. A freedwoman had protected the secrets of the conspiracy with her life, while the senators and knights were busy selling each other out. Tacitus, the historian, pauses his narrative to marvel at her heroism, contrasting her nobility with the shame of the freeborn men. The outcome of the conspiracy was a purge that decimated the Roman elite. Nero did not just execute the plotters, he used the conspiracy as an excuse to wipe out anyone he disliked, anyone who was too rich, too smart, or too virtuous. Rome became a slaughterhouse, but because these were aristocrats, they were often granted the favour of free choice in death, liberum mortis arbitrium. They were allowed to commit suicide rather than face the executioner. The death of Seneca is the most famous scene of the aftermath. When the centurion arrived at his villa to announce the death sentence, Seneca was dining with his wife Paulina and two friends. He asked for his will, but the centurion refused. Seneca turned to his friends and said that since he could not leave them money, he would leave them the only thing he had left, the pattern of his life. He embraced his wife, but she insisted on dying with him. They opened their veins together. Seneca, being old and emaciated from a vegetarian diet, bled slowly. The pain was excruciating. To spare his wife the sight of his suffering, he asked her to be taken to another room. He dictated his final philosophical thoughts to secretaries as he bled. When the blood would not flow, he asked for poison, hemlock, mimicking the death of Socrates. The poison failed to work on his cold limbs. Finally, he was carried into a vapor bath, where he suffocated in the steam. His last act was to sprinkle water on the slaves, dedicating it as a libation to Jupiter the Liberator. Lucan, the poet who had betrayed his mother, found a measure of redemption in his death. He opened his veins, and as he felt the cold seizing his limbs, he recited lines from his own poem, the Phasalia, which described a wounded soldier dying a similar death. He died reciting his own verses. The head of the conspiracy, Piso, died less nobly. He retreated to his house and waited for death, opening his veins while leaving a will filled with disgusting flattery of Nero, hoping to save his wife and children from confiscation. The geopolitical and political changes that followed were profound. The conspiracy stripped Nero of his ablest administrators and generals. By killing Corbulo, the greatest general of the age, and the Scribonius brothers in the aftermath, simply because he feared their competence, Nero decapitated the military leadership of the empire. This paranoia directly paved the way for his fall. When the revolt finally came 3 years later in 68 CE, led by Vindex and Galba, there was no one left loyal to Nero who had the skill to save him. The Pisonian Conspiracy also marked the end of the Stoic opposition as a political force. They were physically exterminated. Intellectually, however, they won. The image of the philosopher dying calmly while the tyrant raged became the dominant image of moral authority in the West. The witnesses to these events, the slaves, the soldiers, the surviving family members, lived in a state of stunned silence. Rome became a city of whispers. To smile was dangerous. It looked like you were happy about the conspiracy. To cry was dangerous. It looked like you mourned the traitors. The historian Tacitus tells us that after the executions, the city was filled with funerals, but also with thanksgiving sacrifices. Parents whose children had been murdered by Nero were forced to go to the temples and thank the gods for the emperor's deliverance. This psychological breakage, this forced gratitude for horror, broke the bond between the princeps and the people forever. The physical facts today that make this story undeniable are etched into the archaeology of Rome and the textual tradition. We have the Annales of Tacitus, books 15 and 16. Tacitus was writing just 50 years after the events, using the memoirs of those who survived, including the memoirs of Agrippina the Younger, Nero's mother, and the official Senate records. His level of detail, the names of the slaves, the specific wounds, the locations suggest he was working from primary police reports. Physically, the Domus Aurea stands as the massive, silent witness to the motive of the conspiracy. You can visit the Oppian Hill today and walk into the octagonal dining room of Nero's palace. The sheer scale of it, the way it dominates the geography of Rome, validates the conspirators' fear that Nero was consuming the state. We also have the coinage of the period. In the years immediately following 65 CE, Nero's coins change. He becomes heavier, his neck thicker, his artistic pretensions more blatant. We see the Jupiter Liberator coins issued later by the rebels who overthrew him, a direct callback to Seneca's dying libation. There is also the tomb of the Scipios and the various columbaria tombs along the Appian Way, where the names of the great aristocratic families, the Cornelii, the Calpurnii, suddenly stop or diminish in the mid-1st century. This genealogical gap is the physical scar left by Nero's purge. The Pisonian Conspiracy was a failure of action, but a triumph of history. It failed to save the men who plotted it, but it succeeded in defining Nero for all eternity, not as a king, but as a monster. The dagger that Scaevinus sharpened may never have struck the emperor, but the story of that dagger cut Nero's reputation more deeply than any blade ever could. I hope you have enjoyed my content as we explore the world's most bizarre and hidden conspiracies. Your love by liking, sharing and subscribing means a lot to me, and your comments are always welcome. See you in the next episode of The World of Conspiracies. Thanks for watching.